morning light rested gently across the high country forest, the kind of soft, Arizona autumn glow that makes even the tall pines seem to breathe a little slower. A chill still clung to the air, but it wasn't unfriendly. It was simply the kind of cold that reminded you life was waking up again. And on a quiet rise overlooking a shallow ravine, a small team of rescuers gathered around a transport crate that held a young bobcat named Koda. The release was supposed to be simple, a short ceremony of sorts, a closing chapter in a long season of healing. But nature has its own way of testing us at the last moment. And sometimes, just before a door opens, life asks one more question. That was the feeling in the air. Something waiting, something holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause as veterinarian Sarah Ellington knelt beside the crate for the final check, running her hands carefully along Koda's shoulders. The rest of the team kept a respectful distance, speaking in quiet tones, the kind people use in hospitals and sanctuaries, and all the places where hope feels fragile. Koda himself was calm, patient. His golden eyes were half-lidded, aware but trusting. Weeks of rehabilitation had brought him here, past the bruises, past the fear, past the trembling early days when he refused to eat. He had learned again how to move with the grace wild animals seem born knowing. His paws were strong, his gait is steady, his spirits were bright, if a bobcat could ever be called bright. Everything said he was ready, but the forest, the moment, and Sarah's fingertips all disagreed. Before she even understood what she had found, before there was a name for it, Sarah's hand stopped on its own, frozen not by fear, but by recognition. Something beneath the fur wasn't like the rest. Something firm, something warm where it shouldn't be. A small, silent interruption, the kind that changes everything. And without meaning to, Sarah whispered, "Hold on, just a second, boy." She had said those same words years ago, in an entirely different moment, to an entirely different creature. Back then, it was a search and rescue dog who had found her in the wreckage of a collapsed building. She said it through dust and tears, and the hopeful panic of a child who didn't know yet that she would survive. All she knew was that the dog, Rex, stayed beside her, that his presence meant something steady in a world that had fallen apart. That memory always came to her in moments like this, moments where life felt delicate and open, like a breath held too long. And here it was again. Wildlife releases often require one last exam, one final assurance that the animal is ready to make it on its own. Not every injury reveals itself early. Not every creature shows discomfort the way a house pet might. Predators, especially, bury their pain deep within their instincts. A bobcat will limp only when it can no longer run. It will hide wounds that could draw the attention of larger threats. And unless a human knows precisely what to feel for, what to look for, some dangers sit beneath the surface unnoticed. Sarah had done hundreds of these exams. Her hands were steady, knowledgeable. But even her training couldn't explain the sudden tightness in her chest as she traced that slight ridge beneath Koda's fur again. Her brow furrowed. She didn't speak immediately. She simply shifted her weight, angled her flashlight, and looked closer. Behind her, one of the volunteers stepped forward. "Everything okay?" There was no fear in the question, just the usual concern that comes from caring. Everyone here had spent hours observing Koda as he grew healthier. Everyone wanted the release to happen today, to see him sprint into the trees and disappear into the life he was born for. But Sarah didn't answer right away. Her silence was answer enough. A few feet away, Matthew Hale stood with his hands in his pockets, watching Sarah with the same quiet patience he had learned in his years as a firefighter. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions. The man had seen too many things go wrong unexpectedly. But he also knew what it looked like when someone discovered something they wished they hadn't. He had seen it in medics' eyes at accident scenes. He had felt it himself, The day he learned he couldn't save a trapped family despite every effort. And he had felt it again later in life, when the doctor cleared his throat before delivering news that would reshape his world forever. News about his wife's illness. So Matthew recognized the pause. He felt it settle into his bones. "You find something?" he asked gently. Sarah swallowed. "Maybe. I'm not sure yet." She stepped back from the crate and took a slow breath, letting her eyes travel across the forest. "Give me a minute. I want to be certain." Even without details, the message was clear. The door wasn't opening today. There are moments in life that seem almost suspended, as if time adjusts itself to let our hearts catch up. Moments when something small, a shadow on an X-ray, a tremor in a voice, a bump beneath fur, hold an entire future in its tiny shape. He represented second chances, the quiet resilience of wildlife, and maybe even their own hopes for healing. And for Matthew, Koda represented something more. The man hadn't said this aloud, not even to Sarah, but he'd felt a strange kinship with the young bobcat from the start. Both of them had carried wounds that weren't always visible. Both were learning to walk forward again. Both were trying to find a way to belong in a world that sometimes felt too big. So when Sarah's expression changed, when her fingers paused, when the air shifted, Matthew felt it in a familiar, almost painful way. He knew what it meant when life whispered, "Wait." In stories about wildlife, kindness, love, loyalty, emotions, people often imagine dramatic rescues or cinematic danger. But the truth is, many of the most heartwarming stories unfold in moments just like this. A gentle exam, a quiet discovery, a decision not with roaring action, but with someone choosing responsibility over convenience, choosing to look closer, and sometimes kindness looks like keeping it closed for now. As Sarah stepped away from the crate and motioned for the team to prepare transport back to the field clinic, Matthew felt an old, familiar stirring in his chest. A sense of duty, a sense of protectiveness, a sense that the next chapter was about to ask something more of all of them. The release would have to wait. If you've ever witnessed a moment where a small detail changed everything, where one quiet pause shifted the course of a life, share a thought in the comments. These gentle turning points often tell the truest stories. Now, let's move into the next part of our journey and meet the man who felt that pause more deeply than he expected. The road back to the field station wound slowly through ponderosa pines, their tall silhouettes leaning just enough to catch the drifting light. In the passenger seat of the transport truck sat Matthew Hale, hands resting quietly on his knees, shoulders carrying that familiar weight that comes from years of showing up, holding steady, and rarely admitting when life had become too heavy. He watched the forest passing by with an expression that wasn't sadness exactly, more like a man walking back through memories he never meant to revisit today. Before the truck even turned the first bend, Matthew already sensed what this moment might stir inside him. It wasn't the bobcat alone. It was what Koda represented, a creature stepping out of pain, trying to find its way, holding on to instinct the same way Matthew held on to habit. And for the first time in a while, he felt something shift. A quiet recognition that maybe he wasn't just here as a volunteer. Maybe he was here because something in the wild mirrored something in him. Matthew had spent 27 years as a firefighter. That kind of work shaped a man in ways he didn't always talk about. The rush of running into smoke, the discipline of not panicking when everyone else did, and later, the ache of remembering faces you wished you could have saved. But retirement left him with a different kind of quiet. A quiet that wasn't peaceful. A quiet that asked questions. Ones he wasn't ready to answer. Questions about purpose, aging, and identity. Those same questions many Americans face once the rhythm of work falls away. Then Linda, his wife, fell ill, and the quiet grew even louder. When she passed, something inside him dimmed, and only those who have lost a lifelong partner understand how the world can keep spinning while your own internal clock feels stuck at the moment everything changed. He wasn't ready for silence. He wasn't ready for the empty kitchen table. He wasn't ready for the nights when the house seemed to breathe without him. So he filled his days with whatever kept him moving, small volunteer shifts, fixing things around the property, sometimes driving to the wildlife center just to sweep floors if they didn't need extra hands. Anything that made the hours feel shaped instead of hollow. In the months after Linda's passing, he had sorted through old boxes in the garage. One afternoon, he found a small tin marked with a strip of faded masking tape. Rex. Training days. Inside were photos of Rex from his early years as a search and rescue dog. Ears sharp, gaze bright, posture proud. And tucked underneath was the last item Matthew expected. Linda's knitted cap, the one she wore during the winter she stayed home, waiting for updates after a massive forest fire. That cap had always carried the faint scent of peppermint tea and pine smoke. When he held it, it was like touching a memory still warm. Without thinking, he slipped Rex's old red collar, a piece he had kept after the dog passed, through the loop of the cap. And from that day on, he kept them both in his truck. It was a small ritual, something to anchor him. Now, as he rode with the team, and with Koda sedated in the crate behind him, Matthew reached unconsciously into the pocket of his jacket, brushing his fingers across the soft wool. He wasn't even aware he was doing it. Habits of the heart don't always announce themselves. Grief has a way of settling into the small spaces of a person's daily life, not in grand gestures or overwhelming scenes, just in the way someone hesitates before washing an old coffee mug, or pauses at the doorway of a quiet room, or carries a dog's collar because letting go feels like a second loss. Matthew wasn't a man who spoke openly about feelings. Many in his generation weren't talked to. Instead, he held his memories with a kind of quiet loyalty. The same loyalty he once saw in Rex. The same loyalty he now noticed in Koda's determined recovery. It wasn't that Matthew wanted to replace the past. He simply didn't know how to move forward without something to guide him. And watching Koda fight through injury and fear reminded him of a life where he and Rex once carried that same responsibility. To step in when someone was hurting, to listen when words weren't possible, to show up even when you felt worn thin. There is something profoundly human about seeing ourselves reflected in animals. A bobcat is learning how to trust again. A rescue dog understands grief without needing to be taught. A man carrying both loss and love in the same breath. These are the storylines that speak to the soul, not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. They remind us that healing rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in small, steady steps, sometimes through a gesture, sometimes through a memory, sometimes through the quiet presence of a living creature who asks for nothing more than patience. Matthew didn't come to the wildlife center to find healing. He came because he needed a place where he could be useful again, a place where kindness still had a purpose. And in a gentle, unexpected way, Koda offered that purpose back to him. As the truck pulled into the gravel driveway of the field clinic, Sarah glanced at Matthew through the rearview mirror. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes, steady, compassionate, told him she understood the crossroads he carried inside him. Matthew stepped out, walked to the back of the truck, and rested his hand on the crate for a moment. Not to comfort the bobcat, Koda was sedated and unaware, but maybe to assure himself that he still had something left to give. Somewhere behind him, the wind stirred through the pines, sounding almost like a voice carried gently on the air. He didn't turn toward it. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't try to shut it out either. The past wasn't finished with him, and neither was the present. If you've ever walked through a season where the past felt heavy and the future felt uncertain, You're welcome to share a thought or memory in the comments. Stories like these remind all of us that moving forward is often a shared journey. Now, let's step into the next chapter and learn more about the woman whose life was shaped by a rescue long before she ever realized it. Sarah Ellington. Long before she stood in a wildlife clinic, examining a young bobcat named Koda. Long before she became the calm voice teams relied on during emergencies, Sarah Ellington learned something about survival that no medical textbook could ever teach her. She learned it on a winter morning that changed the course of her life, one she rarely talked about, but never stopped carrying with her. Most people remember the day they decided who they wanted to become. For Sarah, it wasn't a day she chose. It was a day that chose her, when a simple act of loyalty from a creature who didn't speak her language shaped the path she would follow for decades. And that creature was a search and rescue dog named Rex. Sarah's story wasn't dramatic in the way movies tell it. She grew up in a small Arizona town where kids played outside until the sun dipped behind the pines, where winters were crisp but never harsh enough to frighten anyone indoors. Her childhood was ordinary, filled with the gentle rhythms many viewers her age can remember. Walking home from school, helping with chores, feeling the warmth of a home that cared for her. But the day the old municipal building collapsed, nothing felt familiar. She was 8 years old, visiting her aunt who worked in one of the offices. One moment she was coloring quietly at a desk, and the next she was surrounded by dust, twisted metal, and the strange, muffled silence that follows a sudden disaster. That silence stayed with her. It was the kind of silence where a child learns, too early, what fear feels like. Sarah didn't know how long she was trapped. Minutes changed into something slower, something without shape. She remembered coughing. She remembered calling out. And she remembered her small hands shaking as she tried to push away debris that was far too heavy. Then faint at first, she heard something moving, soft, deliberate, not human. A nose pressed against her shoulder. A warm breath brushed her cheek. Rex had found her. She didn't understand how search and rescue dogs worked back then. She didn't understand how they were trained to locate the hidden, the hurt, the missing. All she knew was that this animal, steady, calm, loyal, had crawled into a space barely big enough for him just to lie beside her. She clung to his fur. She whispered, "Don't leave me," though she barely had a voice left. And he didn't, not for a second. She would later learn that Rex refused to exit the opening firefighters cleared for them. He stayed pressed against her until they carried her out. And even then, covered in dust, ribs rising quickly from exertion, he trotted alongside the stretcher all the way to the ambulance. That image stayed with every person who saw it. But for Sarah, it became something else entirely. It became a promise. People talk about guardian angels, protective spirits, the unseen presence that steps in during our darkest moments. But sometimes, those guardians walk on 4 legs. Sometimes they carry the scent of pine and smoke. Sometimes they don't speak, yet somehow say everything we need to hear. Sarah grew up, but the feeling of Rex's steady breathing beside her never faded. It became the reference point her heart returned to in uncertain times. And as she entered adulthood, she realized something important. The world changes us, but certain acts of love, simple, loyal, instinctive, anchor us to what matters most. That's what Rex gave her, a sense of safety she wanted to give back. When people think of moral stories or emotional journeys, they often imagine grand epiphanies or dramatic turning points. But the truth is, many healing stories begin in small, quiet ways. A dog lying beside a frightened child, a steady presence in the dark, a reminder that kindness can come from unexpected directions and change a life forever. For Sarah, it wasn't about repaying a debt. It was about carrying forward the compassion that rescued her. That's what led her to veterinary medicine. That's what drew her to wildlife work. The chance to protect the creatures who live close to the edges of human life, who often need gentleness in ways they can't express. And now and then, in a quiet moment at the clinic, she would feel a soft nudge in her memory, a reminder of the dog who once found her, and the man who handled him with steady hands. When she first met Matthew Hale, years later, she recognized Rex immediately, though the dog was older then, slower around the edges, but still carrying that same loyal spark. She knelt beside him and felt her breath catch, the way one does when life circles back unexpectedly. Matthew didn't know who she was at first. She only said, "He once saved a little girl. I'm grateful I can thank him." Rex lifted his head and pressed his nose gently to her palm, almost like he remembered. And Matthew saw something in that moment, a connection he hadn't known existed, the kind that ties strangers together through shared history, shared healing, shared miracles. So on the day of Koda's near release, when Sarah's fingers paused on that unexpected ridge beneath his fur, something in her heart tightened in a way she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't frustration. It was recognition. Recognition of the responsibility to look closer, to not rush a life back into the wild, to protect the vulnerable, even when they hide their pain, to stay the way Rex once stayed for her. Working with wildlife requires patience. Working with trauma, animal or human, requires even more. And Sarah had learned long ago that the smallest, overlooked detail could alter everything. She turned to Matthew then, meeting his eyes with a seriousness that resonated between them. Not dramatic, not panicked, simply honest. "We need to bring him back inside," she said. Matthew nodded once. He trusted her instinct without question, because deep down, he knew what she carried inside her, the memory of a hero who never left her side, and the promise she had made to life itself the day he did. As the team guided Koda's crate toward the clinic doors, Sarah walked slowly beside it, her hand resting lightly on the edge. Not holding him back, not holding him in, just staying close, the way someone once stayed close to her. And she knew, they all knew, this next part would reveal something important, something hidden, something that needed to be seen before the forest door could ever open. If you've ever had a moment in childhood that shaped who you became, an act of kindness, a gesture of loyalty, feel free to share it below. Stories like yours help remind others that even quiet memories can carry us through a lifetime. Now let's step into the next chapter and discover what Sarah found during that final check, and why it changed everything. The field clinic sat just beyond the tree line, a modest building, shaped by practical needs rather than aesthetics. Still, it carried a warmth of its own, soft lamplight, polished steel tables kept spotless by habit, and the faint, comforting smell of pine drifting in through cracked windows. It was a place where creatures were cared for, where second chances often began in silence. On this particular afternoon, that silence felt heavier than usual. Before anyone spoke, before anyone even exhaled, the room shifted the moment Sarah Ellington placed her fingertips on the young bobcat's shoulder. It was a pause that didn't belong to hesitation but instinct. The kind of instinct that says, "Look closer. Something's hiding here." Koda, still groggy from the sedative, lay calm on the table. His breathing was steady. His spotted coat rose and fell in soft, rhythmic waves. Nothing about his appearance suggested trouble. But Sarah had spent too many years listening to the quiet language of animals to ignore the feeling tightening behind her ribs. She pressed gently along the ridge again and again. There it was, subtle but unmistakable, a firmness beneath the skin, too defined to be old scar tissue, too warm to dismiss, something Koda had never shown, something he had somehow carried through weeks of recovery. Final checks before a wildlife release might seem procedural, but they are built on hard-won wisdom. A wild animal doesn't behave like a household pet. It doesn't limp unless things are desperate. It doesn't whine to signal where it hurts. It hides discomfort, because survival depends on appearing strong. Predators, especially, like bobcats, mask injury behind instinct. There's a quiet dignity in that. But it also means that a rescuer must be willing to look beneath the surface, to listen without words, to take the time a creature cannot ask for. Sarah knew this well. So when she lifted her head and called for Matthew to bring the portable X-ray lamp, her voice carried a calm certainty that made the rest of the team gather instinctively. This wasn't panic. This wasn't fear. This was the beginning of truth. Matthew stepped forward, setting the equipment beside her with a steady hand. As he positioned the small machine, his eyes drifted to the place where her fingers had paused. He didn't need to be told anything. In his work at the fire department, he had learned to recognize the shift in tone when a medic spotted something that needed more attention than anyone hoped for. It reminded him of the quiet moments after a rescue, when the victim seemed stable, when the worst appeared over. Yet, a trained set of eyes caught the faintest irregularity, a breath too shallow, a pulse too soft, a bruise too deep. He had learned not to underestimate the body's ability to hide its pain. Humans did it. Animals did it, and sometimes even he did it, behind long days and longer nights. While Sarah worked, he held Koda's paw gently, not to restrain him, but to let the animal know a familiar presence was near. It was not lost on him that this gesture mirrored what he once did with Rex in moments of uncertainty. The connection between them was different, of course, but loyalty has its own shape, its own scent, its own gravity. Kindness doesn't always show itself in grand gestures. Sometimes it happens in the smallest touches, like Sarah's palm resting against injured skin, or Matthew standing close enough that Koda could feel the steadiness of the human heartbeat. There's something deeply comforting in that, especially for an audience who understands how much meaning lives inside subtle moments, how much a touch, a pause, or a quiet breath can say. Many of us have been on one side or the other, offering support or receiving it, without ever realizing that a single still moment can change a life's direction. It's the kind of emotion that sits inside stories of love, loyalty, and healing. The kind that lingers long after the world moves on. When the X-ray screen came to life, the room grew even quieter. Sarah leaned in first, brow tightening in focused concern. Then Matthew stepped closer. Frank came to stand just behind them. Even young Tommy held his breath, sensing the gravity. The image showed it clearly. A small sharp object lodged beneath Koda's shoulder blade. Not natural, not part of his body, not something he could have survived with in the wild. Sarah traced the outline on the screen. "It looks like a fragment," she murmured, "possibly from a snare trap." Matthew exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled release of frustration and sorrow. It wasn't anger at any one person. It was the quiet ache of seeing yet another creature harmed by the carelessness of human-made dangers. If they had opened that crate, if they had celebrated that release, if they had let him disappear into the forest, the infection building around the fragment would have spread. Koda would have grown weaker by the week, and by the time he found a place to hide, it might have been too late for anyone to reach him. Sarah spoke the truth without drama. If we had let him go today, he wouldn't have survived long. The words hung in the air, heavier than anyone expected. Life often gives us these quiet turning points. Moments where everything looks fine from the outside, where progress seems certain, where the door forward stands open, and yet something small, easily overlooked, asks us to pause. Sometimes it's a feeling in the chest. Sometimes it's a memory. Sometimes it's a raised line beneath a wild animal's fur. And in those moments, slowing down becomes an act of love. Looking deeper becomes an act of responsibility. Changing plans becomes an act of courage. This is the heart of every meaningful narrative, choosing care over convenience, compassion over momentum. What the rescuers found in Koda wasn't just a fragment of metal. It was a reminder of how fragile the balance between survival and suffering can be. As Sarah prepared the injection to safely deepen Koda's sedation for further examination, Matthew stayed by her side, not because she needed help, but because he understood that being present mattered. That staying, even in uncertainty, is its own quiet form of loyalty. The next steps would require skill, patience, and a willingness to revisit the past, because Koda's hidden injury was about to open more than one old wound, and Matthew was finally ready to face his. If you've ever had a moment where you sensed something was wrong, something others couldn't see yet, share a memory in the comments. Sometimes the heart notices what the eyes overlook, and those small instincts can change everything. Now let's step forward into the next chapter, where Koda's discovery brings back memories of another loyal companion, and the healing that still waits to unfold. In the quiet of the field clinic, while the sedated bobcat rested beneath soft blankets and warm light, Matthew Hale found himself drifting, pulled not by choice, but by memory. It often happened this way. A familiar scent, a quiet pause, an animal in need. And suddenly he was standing at the edge of two different times, past and present, layered like overlapping shadows. Before Sarah even began preparing for the delicate work ahead, Matthew felt a presence he hadn't invited, but welcomed all the same. The echo of a dog who once taught him what loyalty truly meant. And in a moment where life hung in the balance again, those memories returned with a clarity that almost startled him. Because in Koda's silent struggle, Matthew saw the face of Rex, his old search and rescue partner, and he realized just how deeply the past still lived inside him. Working dogs are unlike any others. Their loyalty is not just affection, it's identity, purpose, structure. These animals are trained to read human emotion through scent, posture, and even the subtle vibrations of breath. They know when someone is afraid before a word is spoken. They sense grief long before tears appear. Their world is shaped by duty, and they bind themselves to it with a devotion that often leaves a lasting imprint on the humans who walk beside them. As people age, many discover a similar truth. Purpose is not just something you do, it's something you live. And losing it can feel like losing a part of yourself. Matthew understood that better than most. So did Rex. Years before this moment with Koda, before retirement, and before Linda's illness, Matthew and Rex had been called to a rescue after heavy rain triggered a small landslide near a backcountry trail. The area was unstable and slippery, and most responders hesitated at the steep drop. But Rex didn't hesitate. He looked at Matthew once, ears alert, nose twitching, and then moved forward with deliberate calm, his paws navigating through broken earth and uprooted branches. And Matthew, trusting him more than he trusted the ground beneath his own feet, followed close behind. Together, they found an injured hiker trapped beneath a fallen tree limb. Rex positioned himself beside the man, pressing gently against his chest to keep him warm while Matthew radioed for assistance. The hiker's breathing was shallow, his eyes fogged with shock, but he clung to Rex's fur like a lifeline. Even after the rescue team arrived, the hiker kept whispering, "Don't let him go. Please don't let him leave yet." Matthew would never forget the look in the man's eyes, a recognition that help had arrived, not in the form of loud engines or flashing lights, but in the steady heartbeat of a loyal dog. Rex had that effect. A living reassurance, a kind of wordless kindness. And now, watching Sarah prepare for surgery, Matthew felt the weight of that same loyalty settle into his chest. Familiar, comforting, and bittersweet. It's strange, the way memories work. They don't always return during milestones or anniversaries. Sometimes they drift in during quiet afternoons, when the stakes feel high and the heart feels unguarded. For Matthew, Rex had been more than a rescue partner. After Linda died, The dog had sensed every shift in his owner's emotional landscape. He would sit beside Matthew on the porch for hours, pressing against his leg, grounding him through waves of sorrow Matthew rarely admitted out loud. And when Matthew woke from restless dreams where he reached for Linda and found only an empty pillow, it was Rex who came to rest his head beside him, refusing to leave until Matthew's breathing steadied. People often say time heals, but those who've lived long enough know the truth. Time softens, perhaps. Time changes shape, but healing often comes through companionship, through kindness, loyalty, and the everyday presence of someone who listens without needing to speak. Matthew missed that presence more than he allowed himself to say. The psychology of working dogs offers a beautiful mirror for human experience. These animals thrive when they have purpose. They become unsettled when that purpose disappears. They grow restless, anxious, or withdrawn after retirement, almost as though a part of their identity has been misplaced. Isn't that something many of us understand? Retirement, aging, widowhood, empty rooms. They all carry a quiet shift in identity. And just like working dogs, people often hide their emotional wounds beneath routines, responsibilities, or silence. But beneath the surface, just like the fragment beneath Koda's fur, some things ache. Things that need attention. Things that long for healing. Matthew didn't think of himself as wounded, but he knew he was no longer the man he once was. And maybe that was why Koda's hidden injury affected him so deeply. He recognized the instinct to keep moving forward, even while carrying something painful. He recognized the courage it takes to let someone look closer. As Sarah began preparing the surgical tools, Matthew stepped back to give her room, only a step or two, but close enough that Koda would still sense him nearby after waking. That was something he learned from Rex. Presence is its own form of comfort. He rested a hand on the table, lightly brushing the blanket Koda lay on. A memory surfaced. Rex lying on his final bed. Matthew holding his paw the same way. Not out of fear, but gratitude, grief, and an unspoken promise to keep carrying the lessons Rex had given him. "Stay with him," Sarah murmured. Matthew blinked. "You sure?" She smiled, not big but warm. Animals remember who stayed close. Even in surgery prep, it matters. He nodded, swallowing the ache in his throat. "Rex used to do that for me." Sarah paused, her movement softening. "I know." And she did. She remembered the dog who once saved her life. She remembered how he leaned into her, even years later, like he knew they shared something sacred. Rex wasn't just a memory. He was a legacy, woven quietly into both of their lives. As the machines hummed to life and Sarah called for the final instruments, Matthew took a slow breath, grounding himself. The room felt strangely peaceful, lit by warm lamps, held steady by the soft sounds of preparation. This wasn't just another medical procedure. It was a moment shaped by everything that had come before. Rex's loyalty, Sarah's courage, Matthew's grief, Koda's hidden pain, and the truth that healing, whether for humans or animals, often begins when love meets vulnerability. What they would discover in the next hour would open more than one old wound, and more than one possibility for renewal. If you've ever had a loyal animal who stood with you through difficult seasons, you're welcome to share their name below. Stories like yours remind others that love, in its quietest forms, often leaves the deepest marks. Now, let's step into the next chapter, where Koda's surgery reveals something deeper than injury alone. The small surgical room had a way of holding its breath, as though every metal tray, every warm lamp, every neatly folded towel understood the meaning of what was about to happen. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped behind the tall pines, softening the light that filtered through the window and settling into a golden hush over the clinic. It was the kind of hour where time seemed to slow, an hour meant for reflection, for gentle courage, for quiet work guided by steady hands. Koda lay sedated on the padded table, his spotted coat rising and falling in a comforting rhythm. He looked peaceful, unaware of the hidden danger beneath his skin and the people who now stood ready to fight for him. Before Sarah made a single incision, she paused, not from doubt, but from respect. She knew this moment wasn't only about removing a piece of metal. It was about offering a wild creature the chance to reclaim the life that was almost taken from him. And for reasons she didn't fully understand yet, she also sensed that this surgery would reach farther than Koda alone. Lives, in quiet ways, were about to weave into one another. Wildlife surgeries differ from everyday veterinary procedures. The stakes feel different. The line between life and death can be thin, and the margin for error even thinner. A bobcat's body reacts strongly to stress, and their systems, heart, lungs, temperature regulation, must be watched with careful precision. Sarah had performed surgeries like this before, but every animal carried its own story, its own set of risks, its own whispers of the wilderness that shaped it. She always entered the procedure with reverence, reminding her team that they were stepping into a place between instinct and survival. As she prepared her tools, Matthew stood at the head of the table. He didn't hover. He didn't pace. He simply laid his hand near Koda's front paw, close enough that, if the bobcat could feel anything at all, he would know someone familiar was nearby. Tommy watched from the corner, quiet and wide-eyed. Frank sat just behind him, posture straight despite his age, offering a calm presence the way older men often do when rooms feel tense. The scene wasn't dramatic, but it was full of meaning, full of unspoken hope, full of a kind of quiet loyalty that people of a certain age recognize instantly. Sarah adjusted the light over Koda's shoulder, recalling a night many years earlier when she had witnessed a similar kind of devotion. She had been a child undergoing treatment after the building collapse. Machines beeped softly beside her hospital bed. Nurses whispered in the hallway. The world felt too big and too bright. But then Rex, the same dog who had found her, was allowed into her room. He lay his head on her mattress, right near her fingers, as if offering the steady heartbeat she needed to fall asleep that night. He never took his eyes off her until she drifted off. That memory shaped the way she practiced medicine. She never rushed. She never treated an animal as a list of symptoms. She understood instinctively that every creature, wild or domestic, needed presence just as much as treatment. And now, as she saw Matthew resting his hand quietly at the edge of the table, she felt the full circle of her life turning in gentle, steady motion. This wasn't just a surgery. This was a moment built from the kindness that once saved her. There's something deeply human about these scenes. The small room, the focused work, the silent prayers people whisper without sound. Not the kind of prayer meant for sermons, but the quiet kind, spoken by hearts that have loved and lost and still hope. Matthew wasn't thinking of prayers in a religious sense, but as he stood there, he found himself silently speaking to Linda in his mind. Help him through this. Not because Koda reminded him of his wife, but because Linda had always believed in compassion, always believed in giving a wounded creature a chance. And he found himself saying something else too, words that surprised him even as they formed silently. Help me too. Help me find my way back. Meanwhile has a way of moving through a room, even when the focus is on a single animal. Sometimes, the people standing around the table are carrying just as much pain as the creature lying on it. Viewers often imagine that wildlife rescue is filled with dramatic chases, cliffside recoveries, or tense moments in the field. But the truth is, some of the most important work happens in stillness, in the quiet hum of a clinic, in the glint of a small metal instrument, in the heartbeat of a sedated animal, in the shared glance between people who understand what's at stake. And this is where stories become meaningful, not in the loudness, but in the gentleness. Koda's surgery wasn't only about survival. It was a reminder of the deep connection between humans and animals, of kindness that crosses species, of the ways love and loyalty can travel across years and return in unexpected forms. Sarah made the first incision with practiced steadiness, revealing the swollen tissue beneath. The metallic fragment glinted faintly when the light caught it. It was small, no bigger than the end of a paperclip, but it had lodged itself deep enough to cause slow, dangerous infection. A trap set by someone careless, retrieved now by hands that cared deeply. Using delicate forceps, Sarah maneuvered around muscle and tissue, breathing slowly and even. A bead of sweat traced down her temple, but her expression never faltered. Matthew watched the screen that showed Koda's heart rate. Steady, rhythmic, strong, not unlike Rex's heart had been, even in his final hours. "Almost there," Sarah whispered. It was the same tone she had used with frightened children, with injured fawns, with animals waking from anesthesia. A tone that assured rather than commanded. Then, with a slow, controlled motion, she removed the fragment. The metal piece rested in her gloved palm, darkened by time, jagged at one end, carrying the story of where Koda had been and what he had survived. She set it gently onto a sterile cloth, and the whole room seemed to exhale. People often think healing arrives in grand transformations, but most of the time, it begins with tiny steps. A dog pressing his nose to a frightened girl's cheek. A man standing in silent support as an animal fights for life. A doctor listening for meaning in the quiet. A young volunteer learning what courage looks like. These moments change us, even if we don't realize it right away. And sometimes, a small piece of metal can remind us that pain can hide beneath the surface, human or animal, yet still be brought into the light. As Sarah closed the incision and moved Koda to recovery, she covered him with a soft blanket and nodded to the team. Matthew remained beside the table, adjusting the blanket with careful fingers, as though tucking in a child who had survived something difficult. The next hours would matter. Healing would not be instant, but something had shifted. Inside Koda, inside Matthew, inside Sarah, and inside the quiet bonds forming between them. Now, the waiting would begin. And waiting has a way of revealing the things we most try to hide. If you've ever witnessed a moment where healing began quietly, through a gesture, a memory, or simply being present, feel free to share it in the comments. Your story may bring comfort to someone who needs it. Now, let's move into the next chapter, where the long night of waiting begins, and where hearts begin to open. The hallway outside the recovery room was dim, washed in the muted amber glow of early evening. Beyond the small window, pines swayed gently, their needles whispering against one another in a sound that felt almost like breath. Inside, soft machinery hummed a steady rhythm, monitors tracking each rise and fall of Koda's fragile healing. But the rest of the clinic was quiet. The kind of quiet that asks something of you. The kind of quiet you don't rush. Before anyone sat down or poured a cup of cooling coffee, Matthew Hale knew this was the moment he dreaded most. The waiting. He had lived through enough long nights to understand that action is easier than stillness. Doing something, anything, can distract the heart. But waiting asks you to face whatever you've been avoiding. And tonight, each person in that small makeshift waiting area carried something they hadn't fully looked at in years. After a surgery like Koda's, the first few hours matter more than most people realize. The sedative must wear off gently. The animal's temperature needs to stay steady. Breathing must remain calm, and the body must accept the sutures, the change, the healing path now set for it. Wild animals can be unpredictable during recovery, their instincts pulling them in different directions, toward rest, toward escape, toward confusion. That's why the team stayed close. Their presence wasn't just a medical necessity. It was emotional grounding, because waiting creates a space where people begin to reflect, to remember, to feel, and sometimes to heal. Matthew sat in a chair that creaked under his weight, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped. He had assumed he would be thinking only about Koda, tracking every beep of the monitor behind the glass. But instead, he found himself thinking about Linda. He could almost see her sitting beside him, hands folded in that soft way she had, worry tucked behind her gentle smile. She used to hum when she was anxious, a tune he never recognized but always found comforting. She hummed through doctor visits, through phone calls that held their breath, through moments when both of them pretended the news might somehow change. He reached into his pocket and touched the knitted cap he still carried. The wool was worn, edges soft from years of being handled. Next to it rested Rex's old red collar, a small reminder of a life once filled with purpose. He didn't cry. He rarely did. But something in his chest loosened, like a knot gently giving way. Grief often hides itself in daily life, tucked between errands, behind polite conversation, under layers of responsibility. It doesn't always appear in tears or grand expressions. Sometimes it shows up in the sudden awareness of an empty chair, or in the silence after an old song, or in the pause before someone answers, "I'm fine," when they're not. Tonight, that pause lingered over Matthew, and not just him. Sarah leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely. She watched Koda's slow breathing through the glass and felt something tender stirring inside her. She remembered being a girl in a hospital bed, how time had stretched strangely then, thin in some places, heavy in others. Her hands still smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine soap. She pressed them together, grounding herself. She knew logically that Koda had a good chance, but logic and heart rarely walk at the same pace. And in the corner, Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He wasn't usually quiet, but tonight he barely spoke. He watched Matthew more than he watched the door, learning without words how grown men handled fear. Even Frank, sturdy and even-tempered, seemed softer tonight. He rubbed his thumb slowly over the top edge of his old wedding band, eyes distant. The aches of age have a way of mixing with the aches of the heart, and he carried both with quiet dignity. Waiting rooms hold stories the way forests hold secrets, quietly, patiently, without judgment. They're places where strangers become companions, where time loses its urgency, where vulnerability feels strangely safe. In wildlife rescue, waiting is more than a pause. It's a bridge between the wild past and the hopeful future of the animal recovering behind the door. A bridge between the lives of the people who gather, drawn together by the act of caring for something fragile. A bridge between what once was and what could be. It might seem unusual to speak about love or loyalty or kindness in the context of a bobcat's recovery, but these stories have a way of revealing deeper truths about resilience, about second chances, about the ways living beings find comfort in one another's presence. Even the wild ones, especially the wild ones. At one point, Matthew noticed Tommy shivering slightly. Without a word, he draped his jacket over the boy's shoulders. Tom looked up, surprised, and whispered a soft, "Thanks." It was such a simple gesture, barely a sentence long, but in the quiet of that long evening, it felt like the start of something healing. The kind of moment that reminds a young person that grown men can be gentle. The kind that reminds an older man that he still has something to give. Later, Sarah handed Matthew a cup of hot tea. She didn't say anything. She just placed it in his hands, the way someone once handed her warm cocoa in a hospital room full of white walls and uncertain futures. Another small act, another quiet connection. Frank watched both moments with a knowing expression. Experience gives a man the patience to see how lives knit themselves together without rushing. People often think healing is loud, marked by breakthroughs or declarations. And more often, it shows up in waiting rooms, where no one speaks unless they must, and everyone understands the weight of the quiet. Meanwhile, in its early stages, is slow. It is steady. It lives in the space between hope and fear, and that's where everyone found themselves, waiting not just for Koda, but for something in their own hearts to settle. Hours passed. Lamps dimmed. Voices softened. Koda's breathing remained even, his body responding well to the surgery's demands. When he finally twitched a paw, just a small movement, barely noticeable, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Now came the part that mattered most, not only for Koda's future in the wild, but for the people whose lives were changing around him. Because this story wasn't only about saving a bobcat, it was about uncovering hope in unlikely places, about rediscovering purpose, about choosing to keep going when life has been heavier than you can say aloud. And the next chapter would show what happens when a creature heals, and the people around him do too. Your story might offer comfort to someone sitting in their own waiting room tonight. Now let's move into the final part, where healing takes root, and where the future begins to open quietly, one breath at a time. Morning arrived quietly, as if the forest itself had chosen to tiptoe into the new day. Pale light drifted through the clinic windows, brushing across the floor in soft strokes. The machines that hummed steadily through the night now blinked with calmer readings. Somewhere outside, a lone jay called out, breaking the last thread of darkness. And in the recovery room, Koda stirred. Before anyone noticed the monitors settling into steadier rhythms, before a voice whispered, "He's waking up." Something small happened, so small it could have been missed. Koda moved his paw, just an inch. But in that inch lived everything the night had been about. Survival, hope, and the quiet promise of a new beginning. Recovery in wild animals doesn't come in a dramatic flood. It arrives in little signs, paws flexing, ears twitching, breaths becoming deeper. Nature heals the same way life teaches us, gradually, patiently, inch by inch. These signs matter. They tell a rescuer not just that a creature is improving, but that its instincts are returning. In Koda's case, every movement spoke of resilience. For the team, Matthew, Sarah, Frank, and young Tommy, this was more than medical progress. Each of them carried something into that night. Worry, memory, old grief. And now, the sight of a bobcat's slow awakening felt like a small blessing placed gently in their hands. Sarah was the first to step into the room. Koda's eyes opened halfway, hazy but focused enough to find her. She knelt beside him, adjusting the blanket with slow, steady movements. She spoke in that tone she kept for moments of deep care, a tone shaped by childhood memories of Rex lying beside her in the rubble, shaped by years spent tending to frightened animals, shaped by a quiet faith in kindness. "You're all right," she murmured. "You made it through." Koda blinked once, slow and deliberate, a sign of trust in feline language. Even a wild creature understands safety when it's felt, not forced. Matthew entered next, his step careful, as if he didn't want to disturb the moment. He rested his hand lightly on the rail of the recovery table. Watching Koda breathe more strongly stirred something familiar inside him. Not the sharp sting of loss he often felt when thinking of Linda or Rex, but something gentler, something that felt like possibility. He let out a long breath he had held far too long. "You've got some fight in you," he whispered. Tom peeked in, hesitant at first, then stepped closer when Sarah nodded. He looked to Matthew the way a boy looks at someone he wants to learn from. And Matthew, older, quieter, wiser in ways he never chose, gave him the smallest smile. Even Frank, steady as ever, allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He saw more than a bobcat healing. He saw his son soften in a way that had been missing for years, ever since loss carved its hollow places in the Hale family. Daniel is rarely about returning to what was. More often, it's about finding a new rhythm, a way forward shaped by what we've endured, not defined by it. The same is true for creatures of the wild. A bobcat released back into the forest after injury does not return unchanged. It returns wiser, more cautious, carrying silent stories in its bones. And humans? We do the same. Matthew realized this as he watched Koda slowly regain strength. The ache of losing Linda would never fully leave him. The echo of Rex's loyalty would always warm and burden him in equal measure. But something shifted as dawn filled the clinic. The weight he carried felt different, lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because hope had taken a small seat beside it. Life, he realized, still had room for a new purpose. For Sarah, this moment deepened the circle that began the day Rex crawled into the rubble to stay by her side. The girl who had once been rescued had grown into a woman who now offered that same devotion to the creatures placed in her care. And now, she stood in a room where past and present touched gently. Where Matthew, the man who worked with Rex, and Koda, a creature needing safety, came together as if guided by threads of old kindness. For Tommy, this night would become one of those early experiences that shape how a young person understands responsibility and compassion. Lessons that settle quietly into the day's heart and remain there for life. And for Frank, it was a reminder that resilience doesn't belong only to the young. It belongs to anyone willing to keep showing up, even when the world feels heavier with each passing year. Stories like this one, where love, loyalty, and survival intertwine, remind us that the wild world often mirrors our own. The bobcat recovering in a small clinic in Arizona may seem far removed from the challenges and emotions many people face. But in truth, these stories reach us because they speak a universal language. They remind us that kindness matters. Those small actions ripple into big outcomes. That second chances are not just possible. They're often waiting quietly for us to notice them. And that healing, whether for a wild animal or a weary heart, often begins with someone choosing to care. As Koda grew stronger over the next days, lifting his head on his own, adjusting his posture, responding to gentle movements, Matthew found himself lingering near the recovery room longer than necessary. Not out of duty, but out of quiet gratitude. And each time Koda saw him, the bobcat's ears flicked forward in recognition. Not fear, not tension, but something closer to a soft acknowledgement. A shared understanding between two beings who had both carried hidden wounds. That was the moment that lingered. Not a dramatic release into the forest, not the removal of a metal fragment, but the quiet connection between a man learning to live again and an animal learning to trust again. Sometimes the most powerful turning points are the quietest. As you listen to this story, maybe there's a part of you that recognizes a piece of your own journey. The slow healing, the silent waiting, the unexpected moments of comfort. Maybe you felt the pull between past and present, or found strength in a creature who never spoke a word, yet seemed to understand everything. Take a moment now to reflect on the Kodas in your own life. The moments, people, or animals that helped you find your way forward. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to more heartfelt stories, and stay connected with us. And if you feel moved, consider using the super thanks or donating to help rescue and heal wild animals like bobcats, creatures who, just like us, sometimes need a gentle hand and a second chance. Thank you for being here. Now, let's see where Koda's new path leads next.